as a way of illustrating what culture is, how it works, ideas about cultural relativism. I like this article by Meredith Small called Our Babies, Ourselves. It's actually a very short version of a longer book that she came out with in 1997. So that's a little bit old, but still pretty good stuff. So the first part of it, or I mean, one of the main points, I think, of the article is to impress upon us, how we or they or whoever you are might look strange to someone else. So Robert Levine, who wrote about the Gusii survival skills here, showed some videotape of American mothering practices, and the Gusii mothers were like completely shocked by this and thought that they were clearly incompetent mothers. And as Small says, that we or others might look at them and say, how could you leave your children with? People get very excited about these things. They get a little bit crazy about how people raise children. It's one of those areas that people feel free to comment about on the street and yell at each other about. But again, first of all, it's important to try and understand where people are coming from, and that our practices might look pretty strange if we put them in a cross-cultural context. So that's a good example. My favorite example, I think. Leah, who else is different? The Dutch, what do they do over there? A lot of value on sleeping. Does it work? It seems to.
People fall asleep whenever they want, and no one can wake them up, or like they stay awake. And even past that, they're still even they want.
They value them sleeping more. They've taken the never wake a sleeping baby idea to an extreme, you might say. I guess I was extremely impressed that the Dutch, it actually translates into, at 6 months, the Dutch babies were sleeping more than a comparison group of American babies, a total of 15 hours per day compared with 13 hours for the Americans. Oh, that would have been nice. Oh my gosh, you don't know. I would have loved that extra couple hours. Would have been good. So, the Dutch have this idea of the 3 R's, 2 of which really kind of translate pretty much into English, like rest is sort of the same, and regularity, but their word for cleanliness, the other 3rd R, is different than us, so we don't get the 3 R's. We can't do the 3 R's. But one of the reasons I like this is it's one thing to talk about people who are in way different places and seem to be in a way different situation, but this is a society which is similar to where people have been in the United States, and yet different parenting practices and different childcare practices can result in different things. You would think that babies can sleep and eat and do these things whenever they want, but it turns out to be sort of learned and shaped by your cultural upbringing. And so one of the primary parts of this article, we might say, is to be careful of assuming that our way of doing things, whatever that our or you might be, is the only way or the only right way to do things. That there might be a number of different things. And I wish I could, like I said, it would have been nice to get those extra couple hours. I had tried to implement the Dutch system on my kids, but it didn't work out that well because you can't just raise your children in isolation. They're in a society where they have different kinds of, they're, as the Harkness and Super put it, the society supports this by making, you know, it easy to get to the grocery store and the walking distance for various things. So it's hard, you can't just implement these in your own life, but it's a social cultural thing. This has had some influence, Meredith Small and other anthropologists, in trying to think about when pediatricians are dealing with different people in different societies. Ethnocentrism we take as being something that is potentially harmful, and that you're thinking your way of life is the only one that's correct. But the idea of ethnopediatrics is that you can take into account people coming from different backgrounds and having different ideas about how children should be raised. And before we criticize others, we might look at what other people are doing. So there's some huge issues that people have when they're trying to raise children. Julie, what's one thing that all those babies are doing that is perhaps the most annoying sound in the world? People sometimes, when they're trying to get people out of buildings, if they're holed up in there, will put up big loudspeakers and broadcast the sounds of children crying into them to, you know, it's a once you've heard that sound and have to respond to it, it's very, very difficult to get that out of you. So, you know, a very different approach is some people think that we should have children on a schedule and let them cry it out, and you have to go to sleep by yourself. So, you know, you're going to be in that crib certain hours and you should only be fed at certain times. And so there's ideas that, you know, a lot of people think that it's more appropriate to completely respond to all the cries. And again, if you measure out the amount of time that people spend crying in some societies, it can be quite different in these times. Another huge issue, Nicole, what's the deal there? Very controversial, yeah. What's the position of anthropology on this?
Like breastfeeding them, for longer, they have more like developmental skills, several different stuff. But like, breastfeeding a larger child, you think it's like weird.
It does look weird, especially if they're talking,
Yeah.
you know, and they can ask for it. Seems weird. Yeah, it does seem weird in our societies. Some people have argued that, you know, in comparison to our non-human primate relatives and in comparison to other societies, that we should be going for a longer time. Probably we're not ready to go for 7 years, but, you know, I mean, on the other hand, I think the majority of people in the United States have stopped by 6 months, which seems kind of on the short side. So, I mean, these are huge debates. They do get into controversy. They do seem weird, but, you know, we can make adjustments. Sleep, another controversial one. Luke, what do you got out of sleeping?
Mothers who like sleep for their children, they seem more responsive to each other.
Yeah, there's been McKenna has been a big advocate for co-sleeping, in part because, and this all occurs, the first 6 months of having a child are like no other period, and they demand the very special skills because the infant is all floppy and doesn't know what they're doing, and they breathe in this herky-jerky way that's like weird. It's sort of strange to hear it. And so in some ways, when the child is close to you, it tends to help develop those rhythms of breathing, and they start to breathe in a kind of rhythmic fashion with your own heartbeat and with your own body. And so McKenna has been a real advocate of this. Again, controversial. A lot of people were told that you shouldn't do this because of sudden infant death syndrome, and you should always have your kids in a crib on their backs. Even in our own society, a lot of people were unable to follow the recommendations on that, just because it seems much more to have a child close to you. But, you know, I mean, there's different ways of doing these things. When we schedule our kids and put them in cribs and want to super bottle feed them super fast, why do we do all that stuff? What are we trying to do? What are you trying to teach them? What do you think we're doing? Why do we give them these big rooms by themselves and make them sleep in cribs? Yeah. Huh? Independence. Yeah. I mean, we think that we're inculcating independence in our children. So, I mean, whenever we're thinking about the ways in which we care for children, right? I mean, people are trying to inculcate, to teach them certain things. A lot of times, I think a lot of our practices are driven by this idea of independence. I don't know if it works. It seems like in some ways our children are the most dependent, and many other societies are basically running around fine and independent by the age of 6. Ours are dependent till about age 32. But, you know, that's what we think we're doing. For me, the other hugely important part of this article is how it is that we get culture and how culture feels to us so natural. So on page 4, Meredith Small talks about how human babies are born neurologically unfinished. They're all floppy, they can't do anything, they can't walk, they can't eat, they're just helpless. And so we have to carry them around for all these months, and we have to do all this stuff for them. And their brains are growing. Talked about how the human brain size, you have to come out of the birth canal, in part due to our bipedal adaptation, so that 2/3 of our brain development happens outside. Our biological development happens outside of the womb. And so these things like the way we breathe and how we have our children close to us and their heart rates and the kinds of musics that we dance to when we're trying to put them to sleep or wake them up are going to be all part of a social process from before you're even born, when your mom's dancing around to salsa or Metallica. And so we have this brain stuff going on where the synapses are connecting and they're growing and fusing during this time of intense nurture, of being carried around and being told, this is your uncle, this is your aunt, this is your sister, this is the languages you need to start speaking. And so this whole idea of, is it nature or is it nurture? Is it environment or is it biology? It's going to be entangled with each other, because we can never, there's not, you can't raise a child outside of that social apparatus. They won't survive. So we can't be outside of a particular place and a particular form of nurture and a particular languages that we're speaking. There's not, again, you can't just strip out the culture and say, hey, what would happen if I put this child out with the wolves? They're not going to make it. And the kids that come back from being with wolves, they don't They're not exactly, not in good shape. So, I mean, sometimes some anthropologists, I think Detweiler gets closest there with her thing about how long we should be breastfeeding our kids. I mean, we might try to measure out, you know, what is the best way. But for me, I think it shows that there's not really one way that's always been, or a natural human pattern, just like there isn't one paleo diet that everybody had. People have been adapting and having children in all kinds of different environments, both geographically different and culturally different for thousands of years. So there's not one thing that we can say, aha, this is what you should do. We always have to be aware of this long history.